Well, this morning we're going to pick things up at Deuteronomy 8 in our journey through the Bible. Remember, we stopped at the end of the spring semester. We'd kind of started 8, so now we'll pick up there and we'll move along. Just by way of context, just in case this is sort of like faded from your memory, we just want to remember that the whole book of Deuteronomy, remember, is a kind of an address by Moses to the people of Israel as they're getting ready to cross the Jordan River to settle in the Promised Land. The story of that crossing of the river and the story of the settlement will be told in the next book, which is the book of Joshua, which we'll be getting to eventually. But what we have here is Moses kind of reminding the people of some very important things. And in Deuteronomy 8, one of those things is Moses offers an important reminder about why Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. To say that Israel wandered in the wilderness for 40 years is slightly misleading because that somehow makes it sound like it was an accident. You know, it's like they were driving down Interstate 10 and got off the wrong exit and then had to drive through several towns to get back to where they were going. Actually, the wandering was intentional. It was part of God's purpose. So that's what we're finding out here. I'm going to read to you part of Deuteronomy 8, beginning at verse 1, and then say some things about it. The whole commandment that I commanded you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what is in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And he humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with the manna which you did not know, nor did your fathers know, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Your clothing did not wear out, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you, so that you will keep the commandments of the Lord your God, by walking in his ways and by fearing him. So let's start with that. So we're told here that, as I said, the period in the wilderness wasn't an accident. It was a deliberate effort on God's part, basically to do two things for the people of Israel, which actually needed to happen. On one hand, as Moses reminds them, the purpose of going out into the wilderness, and here just remember, right, wilderness means like there's really no food out there. And there's really no water either. So if you're going to survive in the wilderness, it's going to have to be supplied for you. So one of the things that Moses says here is that Israel was taken out into the wilderness deliberately by God as a way of humbling them. Now, I want to think about that for just a moment. I know we sometimes misuse this word humble, right? And it can actually mean something really different from what Moses is talking about here. Sometimes, right, when we use this word humble, right, it almost comes down to like, you know, if you're humble, that kind of means like you don't really know anything and don't have any good ideas about anything. Well, you know, I'm just a humble person. I don't really know anything. That's not what it means here. Here, humbling means bringing the people of Israel back into line with God after their own sense of pride and self-sufficiency has gotten them out of line. Okay? So the idea here is the purpose of humbling is to get Israel back into a mode of actually really listening to God and actually depending upon him. So that's one thing that's going on here, this idea of humbling. And then the second purpose that's being accomplished in the wilderness is to give the people of Israel a sense of gratitude. And that's where this mention of the manna comes from, right? So you made it through the wilderness. You're here on the verge of the Jordan River, ready to cross over in the promised land. How did you survive that time, right? Did you plan your route so that, every couple hours you were going by a Publix and you could stop in and like restock? Or, how do you think you made it here? You made it here because I supplied you with the manna, the bread from heaven. So the other theme here is gratitude. So humility, gratitude, these are sort of being lifted up as key virtues of God's people, okay? And one of the things we know, right, is that when we sort of depart from those two virtues, pretty bad things can happen, right? When we depart from humility, right, we can sort of get the idea, well, we know the best thing for us to do, right? Because I'm like really smart, and I've got this all figured out. So here's my plan for X, Y, or Z. Or, right, a lack of gratitude means, right, that we kind of cease to be thankful to God, and we get the idea, right, that all the blessings that have been part of our lives basically have been like earned by us. Okay, so this idea of humility and gratitude is like absolutely essential. Now, I want to draw your attention to one verse because it plays such an important role later on in the New Testament. It's Deuteronomy 8:3, where Moses reminds the people of Israel that they've received the manna in the wilderness. And then he says this, that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. Now, this, remember, is the verse that Jesus quotes to the tempter in Matthew 4. When Jesus has been out in the wilderness for 40 days, kind of like the 40 years, right? Nothing to eat. And the tempter, remember, approaches him and says, you've been out here for how long? Oh, 40 days. I'll bet you're really, really, really hungry. And then pulls out his cell phone and, shows them, a Wendy's advertisement or something like that, Would it be great if you could use your power as the Son of God to turn some of the stones out in the wilderness into loaves of bread? Wouldn't that be wonderful? I mean, think of all the wonderful things you could do if you did that. By the way, of course, you could also satisfy your own hunger. You could turn that bread, that stone into bread. This one you could sort of turn into a piece of prime rib, and this one over here a piece of chocolate cake. Doesn't that sound wonderful? And that's when Jesus says, man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. And here's the point, right? The point is that Jesus embodies that humility and gratitude that God's trying to instill in his people Israel. Okay? That is, the point here is not, that somehow if we really try hard enough, we can go without food. That's not the point. The point is that human beings actually desperately need two different kinds of food to be real human beings, right? On one hand, they need the food that goes in here. On the other hand, they need the food that goes in here and goes in here, every word that proceeds from the mouth of God, okay? You can starve to death in two ways. You can starve to death physically, you can also starve to death spiritually. And God's making the point here, right, that Israel needs to be fed from every word that comes from God speaking to her and addressing her. And of course, that's what gets perfectly embodied in the person of Jesus. Which is why, right, he's able to respond to the temptation by saying, no, I'm not going to do it. Because human beings don't live by bread alone, they also live by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Got any more questions? Okay, and then there's the temptation to power. That's the thing that comes next, right? Anyway, we just want to see here a really important point. And that is, for the New Testament, what we're seeing in Jesus over and over again, Jesus embodies the perfect Israel in the way that the historical Israel never did. I think that's a really, really important point. There's a certain sense, right, in which, and this is especially true for Matthew, in which Jesus is himself, as an individual, the Israel, capital I. He himself has become the real Israel. So that's a really important point. Second point that we want to notice here is this. Moses tells the people of Israel, "Know then in your heart that as a man disciplines his son, the Lord your God disciplines you, so that you shall keep the commandments of the Lord your God by walking in his ways and by fearing him." Now, the same thing occurs in Hebrews 12, where we get a really similar notion, right? That God disciplines his people in the same way that a parent disciplines a child, right? And this is a really important distinction. The purpose of God's discipline is not simply to punish. Okay, I saw you, I caught that, go to your room for the next 5 weeks, or something like that. The purpose of discipline isn't simply to punish. The purpose of discipline is to train and correct. The purpose of discipline is to replace bad habits with good ones. And that's what God's doing here. Okay? God's saying, look, I'm trying to instill in you the habit of gratitude and the habit of humility so that you'll begin to live out of your other bad habits, right? Your habit of not listening and your habit of thinking that you're self-sufficient. I'm trying to get you to live out of bad habits and live into good ones. That's part of the whole effort here. So that's important as well. Now later on in 8, another really important thing occurs. This comes at Deuteronomy 8:11, and this is a warning about settling into the land. There are multiple warnings about this, and some people kind of criticize the book of Deuteronomy for being repetitive. And for saying the same thing over and over again. But there's a really important point here, right? When you're talking to people who are stubborn and hard-hearted, you can't repeat yourself too many times. Oh, by the way, let's talk about humility. Have I talked to you about humility lately? Oh, and by the way, I've got another brilliant thing that I want to introduce to you. It's the theme of humility. That's kind of the way it is. So here it is. Take care lest you forget the Lord your God by not keeping his commandments and his rules and his statutes, which I command you this day. Lest when you've eaten and are full and have built good houses and live in them, and when your herds and flocks multiply, and your silver and gold is multiplied, and all that you have is multiplied. So you can kind of see what's happening here, right? You settle in the land, build a really nice 5-bedroom house with a game room and study and 3-car garage and a pool in the backyard. And when your flocks and herds multiply, and when you've got sort of like a substantial stock portfolio and an enormous 401k plan, right? Then there's a danger, and Moses here is clear to lay out the danger, and it's this. And you forget the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and led you through the great and terrifying wilderness with its fiery serpents and scorpions and thirsty ground, where there is no water, and brought you water out of the flinty rock, who fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you, and that you do good in the end. Beware lest you say in your heart, and here's the thing, my power and my might and my hand have gotten me this wealth. You should remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you power to get wealth, that he may confirm the covenant that he swore to your fathers, as is this day. So notice what the warning is, right? The warning is that, you're going to settle in the land, and you're going to go from being sort of like refugee former slaves to people who have it pretty good. Flocks, herds, houses, settle in the land, peace, prosperity, all that kind of stuff. The danger is going to be, right, that you're going to get the idea that, you know what? Start looking around. We've done a really good job, haven't we? I mean, we're like a smart bunch of people. Look at where we've come. We used to be slaves, and now I've got a 3-car garage. Maybe I need a 4-car garage because I'm thinking about buying that new BMW and adding that to my, it goes on and on and on. And the people, right, start to forget how it is that they came to be where they are. And as we were talking about earlier, right, they slip into ingratitude. So gratitude comes back in here as a theme a second time. But I think that the Moses' warning here really is important, right? Don't forget the Lord your God. There's a novel by the English novelist Susan Howich, and it's a series of 4 novels, and the novels focus on Church of England clergymen in the early to late 20th century. And despite being focused on English clergymen, they're still interesting novels. And there's one character in one of the novels who is a relative of one of these clergymen. And he sort of takes a really sort of loose position in terms of his relationship to God. There's a paragraph where he's talking about why he goes to church. And his plan is that he goes to church about once a month. For him, that's plenty. And he says, I go in and I kind of tip my hat to God, and I'm kind of there for a while, and then I walk out. And about a month later, I come back, tip my hat to God again, and walk out. That's what Moses means by forgetting God. Forgetting God here doesn't mean that someone's gone and become like an atheist. Forgetting God here means that they've forgotten who God really is and what he's actually done. Right? That is, Moses' point here is, look, God's the creator of everything. And if it weren't for him, you folks wouldn't even exist. Don't forget that. That needs to be the thing that grounds your whole life, right? Don't forget that part. Now that gets us into Deuteronomy 9, which is also a kind of a preview of things to come. So you might want to think of Deuteronomy also partially as kind of like previews when you go to the movie theater, right? Only I think the movies described here are a lot better than the ones you're likely to see in the theater, because no one's going to get blown up or anything like that. So here's what Moses says at the beginning of Deuteronomy 9. Hear, O Israel, you are to cross over the Jordan today. And by today, Moses means when I get finished, which is actually not today. He goes on for quite a while. Anyway, to go in and possess nations greater and mightier than you, cities great and fortified up to heaven, a people great and tall, the sons of the Anakim, whom you know and of whom you've heard, it said, who can stand before the sons of Anak? Know therefore today, he who goes over before you is a consuming fire, is the Lord your God. He will destroy them and subdue them before you, so that you shall drive them out and make them perish quickly, as the Lord has promised you. Do not say in your heart, now here's the warning, do not say in your heart, after the Lord your God has thrust them out before you, it is because of my righteousness that the Lord has brought me in to possess this land. Whereas it is because of the wickedness of those nations that the Lord is driving out before you. Not because of your righteousness or the uprightness of your heart are you going in to possess the land, but because of the wickedness of the nations that the Lord your God is driving out from before you. Know therefore, the Lord your God is not giving you this good land to possess because of your righteousness, for you are a stubborn people. Remember and do not forget how you provoked the Lord your God to wrath in the wilderness, from the day you came out of the land of Egypt until you came to this place. You have been rebellious against the Lord. Even at Horeb, Mount Sinai, you provoked the Lord to wrath. And there's a description of that, which we'll take a look at in a minute. So let's take a look at this. This is really, I think, significant. So two things are being introduced here that are really important. The people of Israel are about to enter into a land that's already occupied. We'll be reading about that in the book of Joshua. It's not only occupied, but it's occupied by a civilization that's far more advanced than anything the people of Israel have. Okay? These are sort of like independent city-states, and here you want to think city-states, right? These are like kind of sophisticated urban centers, occupied by kind of sophisticated urban people that have standing armies and walled cities and, lots of wealth and all that kind of stuff. God's warning them in a really important way to say, look, you're going to be occupying this land, but don't get the story wrong, because you're not going to be occupying this land because you're so great and brave. That is, when the history of the occupation of land is written, right, it's not going to read, paragraph number 1. The people of Israel occupied the land of Canaan because they were so brave and so courageous and so smart and so good that they were able to defeat the awful, stupid, immoral, lazy Canaanite people, on and on and on. You can imagine how this might, how this kind of might be written in a sort of really colorful way. God's making a really important point. The story that's going to be told in the book of Joshua is not a story about the people of Israel conquering anything. The story that's going to be told in the book of Joshua is the story of something that God is doing. And the really important thing is the people of Israel are never to forget that. Right? This is not a story about what you guys are about to do. It's a story about what I'm about to do. The Lord your God is going before you as a consuming fire. We'll remember, right, that image of the consuming fire returns at the end of Hebrews 12, right? For your God is a consuming fire. The idea right here is the idea of a fire that refines impurities out of metal, right? That makes things pure. So that's the first point. The second point is this. God reminds the people of Israel that they're stubborn. Now, on the surface, that doesn't really sound all that bad, does it? If the worst thing you could think of to say about somebody was, he's really stubborn. That really doesn't sound all that bad, does it? But here it's a really serious issue. Because stubbornness is intended here to sort of illustrate or get at the center of what's at the center of Israel's sin, right? And what's at the center of Israel's sin is, it's not just simply like an unwillingness to change or something like this, but it's a twofold activity. Activity number 1, stubbornness is right where we basically close our ears to the voice of God. That's the first part. So we tune God out. And the second part of stubborn is, right, we turn up the volume on our own voices. God gets tuned out, and we turn up the volume on our voices, right? And so we end up with something like this, right? Well, because I'm speaking with such a loud and impressive voice, that must mean that I really know what I'm talking about. Do those two things necessarily go together? No. As a matter of fact, you can go pretty far with that kind of philosophy on, various cable TV networks, right? Why argue when you can just shout at someone you don't like? Anyway, the idea here is that Israel is being told that she's a stubborn people, a people who have a constant tendency to tune God out and to turn up the volume on their own voice. And this leads to something that really is quite serious. It leads to rebelliousness. It leads to this continuous sort of like rebellion against God. Okay, so notice it's not simply that we're not doing what God tells us to do. It is that we're actually resisting it. We're opposing it. We're working against it. Israel is a rebellious people, and therefore she's not to think that somehow she's being allowed to occupy this land because she's so good and so righteous and so wonderful and sort of like a moral example to all the other peoples in the world, because that's just not true. Now, Moses here does something really, I think, smart. Moses is actually a good preacher, because what he does here is he mentions Israel's supreme example of rebellion. And of course, we all know what that is, right? It's that awful story way back in the book of Exodus where the people of Israel create the golden calf at the base of Mount Sinai. So the way this works, right, is it's almost the first commandment is being given at the top of Mount Sinai. It's simultaneously being broken at the bottom with the Golden Calf Committee meeting. So here's what Moses has to say, or part of what he has to say about that. And at the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave me 2 tablets of stone. Notice that Moses tells us he was up on the top of Mount Sinai receiving the law for 40 days and 40 nights. The same duration that Jesus was at in the wilderness in Matthew 4. At the end of 40 days and 40 nights, the Lord gave me 2 tablets of stone, the tablets of the covenant. Then the Lord said to me, "Arise, go down quickly from there, for your people whom you have brought from the land of Egypt have acted corruptly." I like the way God tells your people. Okay, this is kind of like, I know this has never happened to any of you, but sometimes in a family, right, there's a child acting up, and that's when one parent says to the other, "You need to talk some sense into your son or your daughter." I know that none of you have done that because you're all like really righteous and good, but it happens. So that's what God says to Moses here. Your people have acted corruptly. Notice this. They have turned aside quickly out of the way that I commanded them, and they have made for themselves a metal image. Furthermore, the Lord said to me, "I have seen this people, and behold, is a stubborn people. Let me alone that I may destroy them and blot their name from under heaven. And I will make of you a nation mightier and greater than they." So I hurried and came down from the mountain, and the mountain was burning with fire, and the 2 tablets of the covenant were in my 2 hands. And I looked, and behold, you had sinned against the Lord your God, and you had made yourselves a golden calf. And you had turned aside quickly from the way that the Lord your God had commanded you. So I took hold of the 2 tablets and threw them out of my hands and broke them before your eyes. Then I lay prostrate before the Lord as before 40 days and 40 nights. So let me just say a brief word about that section. So stubbornness here, right, isn't just, they're kind of like unwilling to listen to suggestions, okay? One of my favorite Far Side cartoons shows you're looking at this scene in hell, and there's some people who are walking along like this hallway, and there's like this little cave, and so you're looking at these people from the mouth of this cave, and there's some devils who are kind of like peeking out at these people. And on the wall, on the hallway, there's this box on the wall that says suggestion box. And you see a guy dropping a piece of paper into it, and the devils are kind of like over there like laughing, like, he really thinks the suggestion is going to be like taken seriously, right? It's not just that they're not open to suggestions. It's that in their stubbornness, in their unwillingness to listen to God, they literally create a God of their own making, a God that sort of satisfies their own desires and their own whims. In other words, they basically, it's a conscious decision. We don't know what's going on up at the top of Mount Sinai. We don't know when that guy Moses is going to come down, if he's ever going to come down. And we really haven't enjoyed this little kind of like trip out of Egypt. It hasn't been fun at all. And what we need is, we need some good old-fashioned religion, the kind that we had back in Egypt. That was a really religious place, wasn't it? They had temples everywhere. They're like really religious people. So, let's find us a God that kind of gives us what we want. Reassuring, strong, visible, made out of gold, looks like a calf or a bull. That's really, that beats like this sort of God that you can't even see. That's the religion for us. So stubbornness, right, is the thing that literally leads to the people of Israel being in all-out rebellion against God. It's going to be a problem that will persist over and over and over. Now, the second thing I just want to note here before we stop is something about Moses. Moses comes down the mountain. He throws the tablets of the law down. And I don't think that, he's just like acting out like a temper tantrum, right? It's not like, he comes down the mountain, sees what they're doing and says, well, if that's your attitude, and he throws the tablets down, and kind of walks off. I think it's the throwing the tablets down is a dramatic gesture, right? The breaking of the tablets simply allows us to see the breaking of the covenant. It will be almost like, someone who's sort of just, been at this altar and has just been married. All of a sudden, one member of this couple pulls their ring off, throws it down, and walks out. Pretty dramatic, right? It's a sign that now this covenant which has been made has now just been broken. And so that's what Moses is doing. But the other thing we want to notice about Moses is this. He says more about this, but this will give us a sense. Notice the thing that Moses does here. He lies down on the ground, prostrate, for 40 days, interceding on behalf of the people of Israel. This is really, really important. Important because, among other reasons, one of the things that we're getting here in the person of Moses is we're getting an anticipation of the person of Christ. Just as Moses acts as a kind of a mediator, a kind of a high priestly figure who intercedes on behalf of the people of Israel in the presence of God, we'll see Christ doing the same thing. And also notice this, right? Remember how many times Moses' leadership has been questioned. Remember how many times the people of Israel have wanted to dump him. Remember all the bad things that the people of Israel have said about him. And yet, what is he doing? Lying on the ground for 40 days, interceding on behalf of these people who have treated him horribly. It's an anticipation of what's going to happen on the cross. So in the person of Moses, we're sort of getting prepared for another mediator whom we'll meet in the New Testament. Just to kind of close here, this is what Moses actually says. This is Deuteronomy 9:25. So I lay prostrate before the Lord for these 40 days and 40 nights, because the Lord had said he would destroy you. And I prayed to the Lord. This is what Moses prays. O Lord God, do not destroy your people and your heritage, whom you have redeemed through your greatness, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with a mighty hand. Remember your servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. do not regard the stubbornness of this people, or their wickedness, or their sin, lest the land from which you brought us say, because the Lord was not able to bring them out of the land that he promised them, and because he hated them, he has brought them to put them to death in the wilderness. For they are your people and your heritage, whom you brought out by your great power and by your outstretched arm. Notice what Moses does here. And I think that, once again, the thing that's really important about this prayer, right? Notice Moses doesn't mention a word about himself. Moses doesn't say, look, I've been on the job now here for how long? And you know what I've had to put up with, and I'm still here trying to do my best, and it's really difficult, and God, you should really be thankful that I haven't handed in my resignation. He goes on and on and on. Notice what Moses says. He says, Lord, these are your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt, and with whom you have made a covenant. And the one thing that I know about you is that having made a covenant, having made a promise, you never go back on it. That's who I know you to be. So, you've made a promise to these people, and I know that you're not going to break it. So, let's see what happens. So, once again, we see Moses sort of acting, right, giving us an anticipation of the person of Christ. We'll pick things up with Deuteronomy 10 next Sunday, and we'll see something really important about the tablets of the law, and then I'll make a point about how Paul tries to treat them later on.